Welcome again to LeadBoston Online Inclusive Communication Skills. This is Module 3, Patterns of Oppression, and my name is Eric Esteves.
And I'm Lisa Graustein. Today we're going to be looking at how to identify patterns of oppression in interpersonal interactions and communication.
So before we dive into the details for Module 3, we're going to first review what we did in Module 1, and that covered social identities, which are constructed by society and are often the identities with which we were born.
In Module 2, we talked about the 4 I's. The ideological, the ideas and beliefs we hold, the institutional, how those ideas get built into our institutions and systems, the interpersonal, how they show up in our interactions, and the internalized, what we have taken in about those systems of belief about ourselves and others.
So now, before we start to talk about oppression, we should first define it. And what we're going to do is define it through the lens of the 4 I's. So when you think about ideological, oppression is often the belief that one group is superior to another. Institutionally, it's the policies and practices that discriminate against other groups. Interpersonally, it's discrimination, dehumanization, and prejudice enacted against another based on identity. And internal, it's a sense of self as inherently superior or inferior.
And so when we talk about patterns of oppression, we're talking about learned and conditioned behaviors that we've all been taught, particularly if we've grown up in this country, about how we're supposed to view ourselves and others and what our interactions are supposed to be like. That these are patterns that tell us how to act and react even in new situations, and that these are all patterns of behavior that work to maintain the status quo and systems of oppression. So now we're going to give you a few examples of some common patterns of oppression.
So when you think about some common patterns of oppression, the way in which they are presented include things like stereotyping and dehumanizing, exerting power over another, dismissing or denying someone else's experiences, the silencing of voices, and keeping the privileged or the in-group comfortable.
One of the ways that these patterns can show up, and I'm just going to share a story from my own life, is when I was in my late 20s, I had just facilitated a very complicated meeting, and it had gone well. And a man in his 60s came up to me afterwards and said, "Oh, Lisa, you did such a great job. If I was 20 years younger, I would marry you." And I think he was trying to give me a compliment, but in that moment, what I experienced was of being stereotyped as just a sexualized being or just as a woman and not as somebody with competence and skills that I had just demonstrated. I felt like that what I had just done with that group had been disappeared in that moment, and that he was acting in such a way that was about his comfort, and that anything I would say back, right, I'm either going to be pushy, I'm going to be bitchy, like I felt very confined by that comment and how to respond. And so these patterns are very present, and the way that I found myself responding was to make a joke, right? And I think a lot of us are conditioned when we experience one of these patterns is to make light of it or to make a joke to make it easier for the other person, as opposed to just saying that was deeply offensive or walking away or doing something that might be seen as more confrontational.
So now we're going to take a moment to pause and reflect. When was the time you can remember experiencing a pattern of oppression that someone else was enacting? Or how have you been taught to respond?
When is the time that you can remember enacting a pattern of oppression? And where and how were you taught how to enact that pattern?
When we think about patterns, here are some additional examples. During a team meeting about how to best serve the specific needs of a client, a new staff person who shares many core out-group identities with the client makes a suggestion based on her experiences. A veteran team leader who does not share core identities with the client, but rather holds in-group identities, says, "Your experience is not relevant to what we are talking about." So think, what happened? What patterns were enacted? What systems of oppression were reinforced? You may notice that there was a denial of experiences. There's clearly a power being exerted over someone. There's a silencing of voices. And there's certainly the attention to the comfort of those privileged or in the in-group.
So another example of how we can notice these patterns, and this is a situation that has happened to me with one of my training partners. So I'm white, my training partner is multiracial. We gave a presentation to a large nonprofit about racial justice issues. After the presentation, 2 white employees came up to thank us for our work, and one of them turned to my colleague and said, "Oh, that was so great, you're so articulate, what are you?" Take a moment and notice what happened. What were the patterns that were enacted, and what were the systems of oppression that were reinforced in that interaction? And so you probably noticed there's a stereotyping and dehumanizing of my colleague in that situation, that again, it was about keeping the white people or the privileged people comfortable, and that there was a denial of experience, of humanity, and of being in that situation.
So next time, in Module 4, we'll explore effective tools for interrupting these everyday patterns of oppression.
What we're going to ask you to do between now and next time is, as you go through your week, to notice what are the patterns of oppression that you're encountering, how they show up in your workplace, how they show up in interpersonal interactions. And particularly pay attention to what are the 2 or 3 most common patterns in your workplace, who's enacting them, what are the responses to them. And finally, what we're going to ask you to do is to post and share a situation you encounter involving some of these patterns in your workplace that either you responded to or you wish you responded to differently. These can be ones that you witnessed, ones that you participate in, and we're going to use those situations during the program day to actually practice interrupting with each other so we can increase and build our skills and interrupting these patterns as they're happening.
Thank you again for joining us. My name is Eric Esteves.
And I'm Lisa Grasstein. We'll see you in Module 4.